Have you ever wondered why some nations disappear, disappearing into history, while others survive everything and remain themselves, even when languages, states, and religions change around them? Imagine Central Asia as a giant crossroads. Caravans and armies passed through here, nomads and farmers clashed here, empires collapsed and new ones arose. And there are people living at this crossroads, which sounds like a challenge to geography, the Tajiks. Because in a region where Turkic languages have become almost the rule, Tajiks stubbornly preserve the Iranian language. It's like they're holding an ancient island in the middle of a vast sea. And for centuries it seemed that the answer was obvious. Tajiks are descendants of the ancient settled inhabitants of the oasis, Sogdians and Bactrians, people of cities and gardens who simply survived all the conquests and the change of power. It's beautiful, logical, and convenient. But what if I tell you that's only half the truth? What if there is a crack inside this Iranian island and another world lies behind it? Because Tajiks are not just one landscape. This is Samarkand and Bukhara in memory. These are valleys where apricots and cotton smell. This is craft, trade, urban lifestyle. But this is also the Pamirs and the highlands, where gorges cut the earth as if nature itself had built borders. Where the neighboring village may be closer in distance, but further in fate. And here is our first mystery. How could one nation be both so urban and so mountainous? And why do they describe Tajiks in different places as if they are different people? Historians argued for a long time. Some said, this is an ancient continuity. The settled population simply changed their names and religions, but remained. Others replied, a Tajik is primarily a cultural identity, language, and urban tradition that could spread from above, like fashion, power, and prestige. And there is a third version, the most inconvenient, because it breaks the image of a quiet farmer. What if a significant part of the male ancestors of Tajiks came not from cities, but from the steppe? From those Iranian-speaking nomads whose horses once trampled the space from Altai to the Black Sea region. If this is true, then there must be a memory of two universes in the DNA of Tajiks, about the oasis and the steppe, about settlement and nomadism. And this memory should be recorded not in legends, but in the genome. And this is where our investigation begins. Because genetics knows how to do one thing that always makes you feel a little uncomfortable. It shows that a people is not a single ancestor, but a whole system of layers. And the first layer that we open is the male line, the Y chromosome. It is passed down from father to son and preserves the trace of those male families that in different eras became the core of communities, the elite, defenders, conquerors. If Tajiks are exclusively descendants of ancient cities, we would expect to see a predominantly set of male lineages characteristic of the ancient settled belt of Western and Central Asia, without sharp outbreaks. If there was a steppe strike in their history, we should see something else, the trace of large clans associated with ancient pastoral and nomadic migrations. And here's the first twist. Indeed, male lineages are often found in different samples of Tajiks, which are usually associated with the ancient settled populations of the region. This looks like a confirmation of the urban version, as if the deep foundation of the Tajik world is really old and local. But it's worth taking a step aside, and the picture no longer seems so smooth. Because among the Tajiks there are also noticeable lines that are associated with the ancient migrations of the steppe belt, including branches that spread over a wide area of Eurasia and are often associated with epochs when pastoral communities expanded rapidly and changed the map of the continent. And then a question arises that sounds like a cliffhanger. If there is a steppe trail, how did it get there? Was it a mass migration? Or was it an elite scenario where a relatively small group of men became influential and left a disproportionately large footprint? And most importantly, why did the Tajiks retain the Iranian language instead of disappearing into the Turkic world around them? In order not to get lost in guesses, we need a second key, mitochondrial DNA, the female line. This is the legacy of mothers, which often remains more local in history, because it is women who usually consolidate everyday life, language at home, tradition, and what every child hears from birth. And this is where the moment of truth often happens. When the Y chromosome says the men came, and the mtDNA says the women were local, or vice versa. And this is how we can understand what really happened. The people came as a whole or came at the top. And here's the second twist. Among Tajiks, Female lines generally look like part of the large Western Eurasian and Middle East Central Asian spectrum characteristic of the ancient sedentary belt. Without the feeling that at some point women from a completely different world came here en masse and completely rewrote their mother's story. And this is the most important piece of evidence, because she paints one very specific scenario. The main domestic, maternal roots of many Tajik groups are old and local, connected with the ancient life of oases and mountain valleys. But the men's story could have been more dramatic, more military, more susceptible to external attacks. But if that's the case, then we have another cliffhanger, even more dangerous than the first one. If the women are mostly local, and some of the male lineages are alien, it means that the history of the Tajiks is not a story of one origin. This is the story of integration, the story of how different male groups could enter a settled society, adopt a language, religion, and urban lifestyle, but at the same time leave their paternal marks in their descendants. And then the Tajik world becomes not an island, but a dam that holds the language and culture, passing through waves of people. And now we come to the most subtle part of the investigation, the one where simple schemes usually fail. Because even if we have proven the existence of different male strata, the mystery remains. Why did the Turkic waves not erase the Tajik language? Why has the language changed in some parts of Central Asia, but it has remained here? The answer often lies in the fact that genetics and culture obey different laws. Language doesn't always follow DNA. Sometimes language is a status tool. The language of the city, commerce, literature, religion, and administration. The language in which documents are written and children are taught correct speech. And if Tajik was the language of the prestigious settled world, different groups could join it, including people from the steppe, who eventually became their own, but in Tajik. And that's where the main plot twist happens. Tajiks are not just descendants of ancient farmers, and not just Persian-speaking residents of cities. The Tajiks are a model of how a settled civilization can assimilate external elements without losing its face. But to feel this at the DNA level, you need to take one more step, look not only at the male and female lineages, but at the overall genetic profile, the very sum of all ancestors. And in the overall picture, it is often seen that Tajik groups are on average closer to the Western Eurasian sedentary belt than many Turkic-speaking populations of steppe origin, in which the East Asian component is more noticeable. This does not mean that Tajiks do not have Oriental admixtures. They exist, and this is normal for a region that has been a contact zone for centuries. But this means that the core of many groups looks more settled, more long-lived, as if their genetic foundation was formed a long time ago and then only overgrown with layers. And here we are faced with duality again. Because the Tajiks are not one people in the sense of genetic homogeneity. Tajiks are a spectrum. There are groups that, according to their profile, are more attracted to neighboring Iranian and Western Eurasian populations. There are groups where the contribution of the southern directions is more noticeable, as if there are trails through the Hindu Kush in their memory. And there are mountain communities where isolation could enhance the founder effect, when one or more clans once became the core of a community, and their genetic lines expanded over generations. And therefore, within the Tajiks there may be local genetic worlds that differ more than the common name suggests. And now imagine how much this changes everything. In this case, Tajik identity is not a single fortress nation. It's a union that could take centuries to form. The union of oases and mountains. A union of different clans that have adopted a common language and a common cultural code. And that's why there are so many regional differences, dialects, and local traditions in the Tajik world. Because these are not just variations of the same base. This is an echo of different historical trajectories fused by a common culture. And now the most interesting thing is that if we accept this logic, then many of the mysteries of history suddenly become clearer. For example, why some legends and traditions of the region so often intertwine the urban memory with the memory of warriors and nomads. Why can motives of agricultural settlement and motives of proud military autonomy coexist in the same cultural field? Because it's not a contradiction. This is the legacy of two universes that have learned to live in the same house. Geography plays a key role here. Valleys and oases are contact zones. This is the gate. Marriages, trade, transitions, and changes of power take place here. It is easier to assimilate the aliens here, give them land, a craft, a place in the system, and after a generation they are already their own, speaking the language of the majority. And the highlands are a shield. Ancient structures are preserved there, where isolation works as conservation. And therefore, within the framework of one nation, there may be areas where the genetic picture seems almost like a time capsule, and areas where it looks like a layer cake from different eras. And here's the final cliffhanger, the most important one. If the Tajiks are a union formed by a settled culture, then the main question is not where did they come from, but how did they stay together? How did they survive the Turkic waves, the Mongol storm, the change of states and borders, and still preserve their language and identity? The answer, which suggests the very logic of the DNA detective, sounds unexpected. The power was not in isolation, but in the ability to turn someone else's into one's own. To accept new groups, to absorb their energy, sometimes even their male lines, but at the same time to leave the cultural code unchanged. It's like a river that accepts tributaries but doesn't lose its name. The Tajik world could expand not only through blood, but also through language, not only through inheritance, but also through assimilation. So, who are the Tajiks? It's not pure antiquity or a new construction. These are the people of the crossroads who have managed to turn the crossroads into a house. A people whose genetics preserves traces of different roads, but whose culture was able to become the glue that held these roads together in one story. Their origin is not a lineage, it's a pattern. And that is why it is so difficult to explain in one word, because when you look at the Tajiks as a monolith, you only see a beautiful legend. And when you look at them as a federation of different historical strata, you see the real Central Asia, a place where people survive not because no one came to them, but because they have learned to experience the arrival of each new world. And here is my question to you, which we will put an end to, but not close the case. If you could choose the following DNA mystery, who would you like to analyze in the same detail? Uzbeks, Pamirs, Karakalpaks, Turkmens, or maybe some small people that almost no one talks about? Write in the comments and we will continue the investigation.